Now, let us talk to a man who has a very interesting view about the sage advisors who are leading so many politicians down a garden path and not allowing them to climb over the fence into freedom. Trevor Kavanagh, former political editor of The Sun, political columnist now at the newspaper. Trevor, very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
I read with some interest your piece yesterday, Trevor, because it totally and utterly chimed with what I've been saying for a very long time, that these sage advisors who we refer to as the scientists, many of them are not actually scientists at all, are they?
Not in the sense that this epidemic requires, anyway. They're not virus experts. They're academics, not medical experts.
Right, exactly right. And your claim, and I think it's probably backed up by the science, if you like, is that Boris Johnson, at heart, would like to lift this lockdown quicker than they would like him to. Where do you think that's all going, and how do you think he gets out from under their influence?
Well, as I understand it, he is held back by the advice of SAGE on the number of deaths, and quite rightly in the sense that only a few weeks ago we were looking at about 1,800 a day dying. That was the maximum in January.
Yeah.
But that is coming down very rapidly thanks to the sensationally successful vaccine program, and indeed the lockdown itself, I guess. So the numbers are now, according to the last couple of days' figures anyway, around 300 plus. So they're rapidly declining from that 1,800 figure to a much, much lower figure. Once they get to 100, they reckon, people in government that I've spoken to believe that Boris will be hard pressed and indeed doesn't really want to maintain the lockdown beyond the point of, say, 100 a day. Well, 100 a day is very bad news for the 100 who die, but for the economy and for the country, I think it's the point at which we have to let go.
Yes, I think so. And I mean, towards the end of last year, before this new variant came in on the 18th, I was always pointing out to people that the average number of deaths per day in this country on any given day, regardless of the pandemic, is about 1,600 anyway. You know, a week rather. A day. So in terms of like the numbers of people who are affected by this disease outside of COVID, in terms of the people suffering from the lockdown, who can't get furlough money, who can't open their restaurant, who can't go back to work. I mean, the damage there does not seem to even being looked at by the sage advisors.
No, and I think that you're right, that the number of excess deaths, which is everything over the average over the 5-year period, is now basically running at that average. So one of the reasons for that is that there have been virtually no flu cases by comparison with previous years because of the lockdown, because all attention is focused on COVID. But there are members of the SAGE workforce who are really very dubious characters, in my opinion anyway, and not least of them is Neil Ferguson, who's now predicting that we could see another up to 167,000 deaths from this bug, when quite clearly the numbers are falling as fast as it's possible to imagine. There's also a woman named Susan Michie, who is not a virologist or in any way directly a medical expert. She's a behavioral scientist. She may have medical qualifications, but not directly in the field of this particular virus. Susan Michie is avowedly a communist. She's a member of the British Communist Party. And I think we've seen from some of the very extreme left-wing activists involved in British society, not least the National Education Union, that there are people who do not particularly want to see Boris Johnson have a good war. They're rather relishing the fact that this has been it's been a rough ride for Boris, to be frank. And now that there is a way out, which is clear and specific, they seem to be dragging their feet and putting up new objections about reasons why we shouldn't lift lockdown.
Well, that seems to be the trouble, doesn't it? I was watching Matt Hancock yesterday, and as he was revealing these figures, these statistics of, 95% of the over 70s have now been vaccinated. He's now asking for people to get in touch if they haven't been contacted yet by the NHS to get the vaccine. I was waiting for the next part of the sentence almost to say, and as a result of that, we can now do this. But there was no second part of the sentence. So all of the talk last year about when we get the vaccine, that will be a game changer. We're still waiting for the game to change.
Indeed, and I think that it is changing. Regardless of what people's objections may be. We are seeing a fall in infections quite dramatically. We're seeing a fall in hospitalizations. And we're seeing, as I said, a very dramatic fall in the number of daily deaths. So we are getting to the point where Boris has set the date of February the 22nd for setting out a roadmap for some sort of recovery plan and return to normal. And he's also said that schools will return on March the 8th. Now, there's an enormous amount of pressure building within the Conservative Party and elsewhere, in every home in the land probably, for that to be brought forward to the end of the half-term holiday, which is a week or two earlier. And indeed, Scotland and Wales are already doing this for primary school children. I think the pressure is on Boris to accelerate that programme.
And what do you think is behind these sage advisors and their wish to continue with the lockdown? Do you think it's just that they quite like it? Do you think it's that they quite enjoy the kind of power? Or what do you think their psychology is?
Well, I wouldn't want to imply too many motives to the sage group, because quite clearly they would see themselves as being the moderators in a very complicated field, which is deciding as and when it's safe to lift the lockdown. But I think there is no doubt that there is, in some areas of our society, an actual relish of the fact that we're locked down, the fact that the government is pinned down, the fact that we are able to dictate to people. People, once they're given powers, as we've seen many times in recent months, love to impose them. And I think that there are many members of Parliament who are very worried about civil liberties, and were very worried at the time that these emergency powers were effectively invoked at the beginning of the first lockdown. And they forecast exactly the situation, which is that people, once given powers to affect the lives of other people, will carry on using them long after their sell-by date.
Quite, because we seem to have given up altogether any kind of vestige of democracy or any kind of conversations in Parliament about the next stage, because all of the things that we were told would happen, i.e., don't worry, there will be another debate before we impose any further lockdowns, that seems to have gone by the wayside now.
Indeed, and I think that's another very serious subject, Mike. I think that the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, is resisting moves by various people, not least the leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who has called for the full return of Parliament. But Lindsay Hoyle is digging his heels in because he has decided the risk is too great. And I think that as long as the Parliament is not sitting properly, and if necessary, why don't we give MPs the jab so that they can carry on as key workers? We are not seeing democracy being carried out in our national parliament.
No, we're certainly not. I had an idea last week. I don't know what you think of this. Is that if you need to stay at home because you've got some vulnerabilities and you're worried about going back to work as an MP, fine. But we should have a second tier payment system, which means that one, you get less money, like some poor people who are currently on furlough on 80% of their salary. You don't claim expenses, which many of them have been doing. I mean, I couldn't believe when I saw last week the numbers of front bench Labour MPs who were claiming all sorts of things, including first class rail travel up and down the country when we're supposed to be in a pandemic. I mean, it seems extraordinary to me that MPs will continue to insist on a lockdown, which doesn't affect them financially whatsoever.
No, it's amazing, really, how people's scruples. I mean, you've also got queue jumping by people who are not frontline workers and have no justification whatsoever for getting ahead of the vulnerable in the queue for vaccines. You've got the story that you mentioned earlier about Mike Tindall and the furlough scheme. Yeah. I think the furlough scheme is going to be looked back on as a huge funding for fraud.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that Mike Tindall is guilty of fraud, but I do think that someone who is worth about £15 million and is the only employee, as far as I can see, or as far as the records show, is receiving furlough from the government. I think that there are a lot of people who are pushing this to the limit.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, it is always going to be the case that there will be fraud out there. And we've seen in some cases, some celebrities, I think Steve Coogan was one who furloughed his gardener. And Posh Spice was among them as well. Both of them, I think, reversed the decision when they realised somebody had found out about it. It wasn't as if their conscience had suddenly pricked them. But, unfortunately, people who we now have a society which is split between those who can work from home very happily in their nice airy front room or their nice airy study with a very nice new Apple Mac PowerBook, and those who have to actually physically go to work to get paid.
Yes, I think there are a lot of stories out there of deprivation, genuine deprivation and pressure and anxiety. People who have to work simply to keep their body and soul together, really. But also at the same time having to look after kids and home educate them. These are all very difficult positions for people with no alternatives. And there are lots of those in the country who are actually enjoying the lockdown in the sense that they might be on guaranteed incomes, they might be public sector workers, they're in good jobs, and they can, as you say, work from rather comfortable surroundings. But there are a hell of a lot out there who aren't, and whose jobs are at risk, and their livelihoods are at stake.
Absolutely right. And those are the very people that Boris needs to think about. And those are the very people, many of whom probably are responsible for giving him his 80-seat majority, that he needs to start thinking about.
Yes, and I think he is thinking about them. I mean, from what I hear, he would like to be able to act sooner rather than later. And of course, he's fully aware, as Rishi Sunak will be telling him every time they meet, that the economy is in a very serious way. One day when we stop thinking about COVID and hearing about COVID at every tick of the clock on the radio news, we will start looking at the price we're going to have to pay for this in terms of the cost is just gigantic. We're going to see real implications for our daily lives. I mean, everything from road repairs to major health service funding and so on. Where is this money going to come from once we've decided that we can get back to work and there's no jobs?
Yes, exactly right. And finally, Trevor, what are you making of the situation with the Labour Party at the moment? Because Keir Starmer, I think, generally, universally was thought to have had a pretty bad week last week. He made his blunder at Prime Minister's questions about, he couldn't remember what he'd said about the European Medicine Agency. He then got involved in a bit of a punch-up, it would seem, figuratively speaking, with Boris after PMQs behind the Speaker's chair. And also a lot of people in the Labour Party saying, he's not really what we thought.
No, and I think that this is coming home to roost for the Labour Party. But I'm no fan of Keir Starmer for a variety of reasons, not least his persecution of 24 Sun journalists on a witch hunt, on which they were all cleared. So my starting point is that I'm not a fan. But on the other hand, for many people, he is actually a very plausible-looking person who he's a QC. He's obviously intelligent. He is, in theory, this sort of person that the Labour Party would need in order to bring it back from the Corbynite days. And yet, it's not working. His own personal ratings are fine, but the ratings of the Labour Party are dismal in the circumstances. They should be miles ahead right now. And what I think is being revealed here is a terminal decline in the Labour Party itself. This bickering, squabbling ship is sinking. It's beyond salvaging. And I think that many senior Labour figures are now beginning to wonder what on earth they're going to do in order to create an opposition which is fit for purpose.
Yes, I think that's right, because they lost Scotland because they weren't careful enough about protecting it. They apparently have now lost the north of England and large parts of it, and they're left with a sort of rump of Putney, it would seem, and a bunch of Remoaners.
Yes, and that Red Wall vote, by the way, is not a group of Labour voters, ordinary members of the public who dearly wish they had a Labour Party to support. These are people who have given up on the Labour Party as it stands and have left, and they really want to see more of what Boris Johnson offered them in the general election, which made them vote for the Tories. They don't want to go back to Labour. They don't want a soft left style Tory party. They want a party that delivers jobs and prosperity to their region and to them and their families.
Yes. And they're only going to get that one way. Trevor, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Trevor Kavanagh, political columnist at The Sun, with a view on Boris Johnson that he wants to get us out of this, but he's being prevented from doing so by this rather odd collection of sage advisors, many of whom are not advising him on the basis of any medical knowledge, but are advising him on the basis of probabilities, of sort of, psychological manoeuvrings, and behavioural science. It doesn't make much sense to me.